They thought he was just another student until the boy they mocked revealed he was the Mafia boss's son. In the crowded school hallways, whispers turned into cruel laughter. A group of bullies cornered a quiet black boy, hurling words meant to break him, but what they didn't know was that his silence carried a shadow far greater than their cruelty, a power born from loyalty, blood, and a name that struck fear in the darkest corners of the city. He sat alone at lunch, his tray untouched, while cruel laughter echoed across the cafeteria. One boy yanked his backpack, another shoved his shoulder. They mocked his skin, his silence, his difference. He looked down, refusing to fight back. Every insult carved deep, but none of them knew they were crossing a line they could never return from. The cafeteria smelled of greasy pizza and overcooked fries, but he couldn't taste anything. His stomach twisted with the heavy weight of humiliation. The laughter grew louder, echoing in his ears like a cruel soundtrack to his pain. His heart pounded, not with anger, but with a storm of something deeper restraint. He knew what he carried. He knew who waited for him beyond those school gates. He was not just any boy, though his classmates believed otherwise. The bullies circled him like predators who sensed weakness. One snapped his fingers near his face, another spilled milk across his tray deliberately, watching it drip into his lap. He didn't flinch. He had learned long ago that silence was more powerful than rage. But silence also hurt. Inside, memories of his mother's soft voice telling him to stay strong. When the world mocked him, whispered through his thoughts. His fists tightened under the table, nails digging into his palms. He could crush them. He could make them regret every word, every shove. But he stayed still, because he had promised his father to never reveal who he was, not here. Not in this world where kids still thought cruelty made them powerful. The bullies laughed harder, emboldened by his quiet. A girl nearby looked on, her eyes flickering with pity, but she said nothing. No one ever did. That was the cruelest part, not the insults, but the silence of those who saw and chose to look away. He felt invisible, though every word stabbed him into reality. They called him names, twisted versions of who they thought he was, labels he'd never chosen: black, poor, nobody. They thought they knew him, they thought he was easy prey. But beneath the surface, a truth lingered like a shadow. He was the son of a man whose name carried weight in every dark alley and high-rise penthouse. His father's empire stretched far beyond this town, a web of influence and fear. The boy had grown up watching men twice the size of these bullies bow their heads in respect when his father entered the room. Yet here he was, letting scrawny kids shove him around. Because power, he knew, wasn't in showing your teeth at the first insult. Power was in patience, in control. Still, the ache in his chest wouldn't fade. When the final bell rang that day, he walked out slowly, his bag hanging loosely over his shoulder. The bullies jeered from a distance, their laughter still buzzing in his ears. The sky above was gray, the kind of sky that promised rain but didn't deliver. He kept walking, ignoring the sting of shame. Yet as he reached the school gates, the sound of an engine rumbled behind him. A sleek black car pulled up, windows tinted, the kind that didn't belong in small towns but in movies about men who controlled cities. The door opened, and out stepped a figure that silenced the air around him. His father, sharp suit, cold eyes, presence heavier than stone. Conversations stopped. A few students froze in place, their curiosity clawing at them. Teachers paused at the doors, their smiles vanishing. Everyone felt it, that chill of power you couldn't name but couldn't deny. The boy lowered his head, as though caught between two worlds. His father didn't smile. He never did in public. He simply placed a hand on his son's shoulder, a gesture both protective and possessive. It was then that whispers began. The Mafia boss, the man whose name was spoken only in rumors. The bullies, standing across the yard, paled, their bravado drained like water spilling from a broken glass. They had mocked a boy, yes, but not just any boy. They had spat on the air of a shadowed throne. That night, word spread faster than wildfire. Phones buzzed, whispers stretched from house to house. The quiet black boy wasn't just another face in the hallway. He was a Mafia son, but power didn't erase pain. Lying in his bed that night, he stared at the ceiling. His father had said nothing about the bullying, nothing about the cruelty. Only one sentence had left his lips. You must decide who you are, not them. The words cut deeper than any insult, because who was he? Was he the boy mocked for his skin, his silence? Or was he the heir to an empire built on fear? He didn't know. He only knew he couldn't hide forever. The next day the bullies avoided him. They didn't shove him, didn't mock him, but their eyes carried fear instead of laughter. It should have felt like victory. Instead it felt like isolation. Now he wasn't just different, he was untouchable. The girl who had looked at him with pity yesterday couldn't even meet his gaze today. The cafeteria grew silent when he walked in, the kind of silence that made you feel more alien than laughter ever did. He ate alone, again, but this time, not because they pushed him away. This time, because no one dared sit beside him, and that's when he understood the curse of power. His father's shadow protected him, but it also caged him. The bullies would never touch him again, but neither would anyone reach out a hand in kindness. His world had shifted overnight, but the loneliness remained. He had wanted respect, not fear. He had wanted friends, not silence. Still, the bullies weren't free from consequences. One by one their parents received quiet visits. Unmarked cars, polite men with hard eyes at their doors. Nothing violent, nothing dramatic. Just words spoken low enough to chill bones. Promises that were more like warnings. The boys never spoke of it, but their eyes told the story. They would never cross him again, yet the boy didn't smile. He didn't celebrate their fear, because in his heart he carried his mother's voice. She had raised him to be more than a name, more than a legacy of fear. And as he walked those halls with his head high, he realized the real victory wasn't in watching them tremble. It wasn't knowing he hadn't lowered himself to their level. He hadn't let hate define him. He had risen above. But nights were still heavy. He would lie awake, wondering if people would ever see him not the son of a mafia boss, not the quiet black kid to be mocked, but simply as himself. He longed for that day, a day when power and skin and silence wouldn't define him. Until then, he carried his pain like armor, invisible but unbreakable. And though the world didn't know it yet, the boy they had once mocked had become something far greater than fear. He had become a symbol of resilience, a lesson carved in the silence of a school hallway that true strength isn't cruelty, but the courage to rise above it. That night, a black car waited outside the school gates. The boy's father stepped out, sharp suit, cold eyes, the aura of a man no one dared cross. Whispers spread like fire. The mafia boss himself had arrived. Teachers froze, bullies turned pale. The boy stood behind him, no longer just a victim, but the heir to a name that could silence entire streets. The car door had opened with the weight of thunder, though no sound came except the quiet slam when it shut. The headlights burned against the dusk, and the smell of the city's evening dust lingered in the air. The students who had lingered too long in the schoolyard, laughing, joking, or scrolling through their phones, felt the atmosphere shift, as if the air had grown heavier. Something ancient, something primal, whispered to them that danger had arrived, not in the form of chaos, but in the form of order so strict it was suffocating. A predator did not always roar. Sometimes it walked in silence, and the silence itself was louder than screams. The man's shoes clicked against the pavement as he approached, each step deliberate, echoing against the hollow gates of the school. He wasn't tall in the way athletes were, wasn't loud in the way men who sought respect pretended to be. His power wasn't in what he showed, but in what he didn't need to. His face was carved with lines that told stories of wars fought in alleys and skyscrapers, of negotiations that ended in blood or silence. His eyes, cold and sharp, scanned the crowd as though he could see into the very bones of those around him. The bullies who had spent their days laughing at his son, boys who had believed cruelty was power, now stood like statues frozen mid-breath. Their mouths hung open slightly, as if their words had been stolen by the presence of something far larger than they could ever comprehend. Teachers emerged from the school doors, their smiles plastered on out of habit, but the moment they saw him, their expressions faltered. This was not a man who could be spoken to casually. This was not a parent you could placate with polite lies about boys being boys. His presence stripped them of authority, reducing them to witnesses of something beyond their paychecks and school rules. Whispers crawled through the crowd, moving like a current of electricity. It's him. The stories were true. The mafia boss, the man whose name you don't say after dark. Phones were quietly lifted, recording from shaky hands, but even the devices seemed to fear being too obvious. No one wanted to be caught. And then, behind him, stood the boy. No longer just a quiet, solitary figure who kept his eyes on the floor and absorbed cruelty like a sponge. No, tonight he was something else. The glow of the headlights carved him into a silhouette framed by power not of his own making, but inherited, born from the shadow of his father's empire. His silence no longer looked like weakness, it looked like patience. His lowered eyes no longer seemed like defeat, they seemed like calculation. And suddenly, every insult thrown at him, every shove, every sneer, replayed in the minds of his tormentors with new, terrifying weight. Because now they understood. The boy they had mocked carried a name that could make their families vanish in the middle of the night. A name that could stop conversations and bend men to their knees. The bullies turned pale, their laughter long forgotten. Their minds raced through every cruel word, every push in the hallway, every shove against the lockers. Their bravado, once fueled by the audience of peers, crumbled like ash in the wind. One of them tried to swallow, but his throat was too dry. Another shifted his feet, as if considering running, but his legs felt anchored to the ground. Fear wasn't loud. Fear was paralyzing, suffocating, the kind that whispered, "You've gone too far." The father's gaze finally settled on the group. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His silence was a verdict. His stare, a sentence. He placed a hand on his son's shoulder, a gesture simple yet profound. It was protective, but also declarative. It was as though he was telling the entire schoolyard, "This is mine. This is blood. And whoever touches him touches me." The message was clear, wordless, undeniable. No one dared move. Even the teachers whose duty it was to maintain order said nothing. They knew this was beyond attentions, beyond calls home, beyond schoolyard discipline. This was a different world colliding with theirs, a world where power didn't come from rules written in books, but from loyalty, violence, and fear. The boy felt the weight of his father's hand and the weight of 1,000 eyes. He wasn't sure which was heavier. For years, he had tried to hide this part of himself, to live quietly, to not let the shadow of his father define him. But now, in the light of the schoolyard, that shadow loomed taller than ever. He felt exposed, not just as a victim, but as something else, a warning, a symbol. He didn't know if he wanted this. He didn't know if he deserved it. All he knew was that the balance of his life had shifted forever in that moment. The car door opened again, and 2 men stepped out, dressed in black, their expressions blank, their movements controlled. They didn't look like bodyguards, they looked like soldiers. Their presence made the whispers turn into silence. Even the air seemed to hesitate. They didn't speak, didn't move except to stand a few steps behind the father, their eyes scanning the crowd with mechanical precision. The message was clear. This was no ordinary pickup. This was a demonstration, not of love, not of parental concern, but of power. The father finally spoke, his voice low, deep, and calm. It wasn't loud, but it carried, slicing through the silence like a blade. "Come," he said to his son. Nothing more. No questions about his day, no warm smile, no scolding, just one word, one command. The boy obeyed, stepping forward. His heart thudded in his chest as he felt the eyes of the bullies burn into his back, but none dared move. He entered the car, sliding into the leather seat that smelled faintly of tobacco and money, the scent of nights where deals were made and futures decided. As the door shut behind him, the whispers rose again. The car began to roll forward, its engine humming like a predator's purr. The father sat beside him, silent, his hands resting on a cane that wasn't for support but for authority. For several minutes neither spoke. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows, neon signs flickering like ghosts in the night. Finally, his father broke the silence. "You let them touch you," he said, not with anger but with disappointment. "You let them speak." The boy swallowed, his throat dry. "I didn't want to bring you into this." His father turned his head, his cold eyes narrowing slightly. "You think silence protects you. Silence makes you prey. Respect is not given, it is taken. And you," he paused, his gaze piercing into his son's soul, "you carry my name. Do you understand what that means?" The boy looked down at his hands. He had heard this before all his life. His name was not his own. It was a crown and a curse, a weight he couldn't put down, no matter how much he wanted to. His silence in the cafeteria, his patience, his refusal to fight it hadn't been weakness. It had been his attempt at being different, at breaking the cycle. But his father didn't see it that way. His father saw only dishonor and restraint. The boy wanted to scream, to tell him that he didn't want to be feared, that he didn't want people to bow to his name. He wanted to be known for himself, not for the shadow he carried. But the words caught in his throat. He knew his father wouldn't understand. In his father's world, there was no room for softness, no space for empathy, only strength, only fear. As the car sped through the city, the boy leaned his head against the window, watching the world blur by. He thought of the bullies' faces, pale with fear. He thought of the teachers frozen in place. He thought of the whispers spreading like wildfire. His life at school would never be the same. They would never touch him again. But they would never look at him the same way either. He had won, but he had lost something too. He had lost the chance to ever be ordinary. And in the back of that black car, under the cold gaze of his father, he realized something that made his chest ache with both pride and sorrow. He was no longer just a victim, but he was no longer just a boy either. He was a name, a shadow, a legacy, and no matter how much he wished otherwise, there was no going back. The next morning, the bullies were called out not by fists, but by fear. Their parents received quiet visits, doors knocked at midnight. No one dared touch the boy again. Yet, despite his power, he chose not revenge but dignity. He walked those halls with his head high, teaching everyone a lesson. True strength isn't in cruelty, but in rising above it. The school was not the same when the sun rose that day. The corridors, once loud with careless chatter and footsteps echoing in chaos, now carried a silence that weighed heavily on everyone's chest. The students whispered less, laughed less, their eyes darting toward him in both curiosity and caution. He hadn't changed outwardly. He still carried the same bag, wore the same uniform, walked with the same quiet steps. But something invisible surrounded him now. Something that made every head turn and every heart hesitate. He was no longer just a boy in the crowd. He was a presence. The bullies, the same ones who had pushed him into lockers, stolen his books, mocked his skin, and spat cruel words into the air like venom, were different now too. Their shoulders, once puffed with false bravado, now slumped under the weight of unspoken terror. Their voices, once booming with laughter, were muted into whispers, broken sentences that never seemed to finish. Their eyes avoided his, but not in the way of ignoring him though. It was the avoidance born of fear, the kind where meeting someone's gaze felt like inviting doom. They walked with careful steps, as if even brushing against him by accident might summon consequences they couldn't bear, because the visits had already come. The knocks at midnight, soft, deliberate, unhurried, had echoed through their houses. Doors opened by trembling fathers, mothers clutching robes tighter to their chests, children peering from behind banisters. The men who came were not loud, not violent. They were polite. They spoke in low voices, asking simple questions, stating simple facts, the kind of questions that sounded harmless but carried daggers between the syllables, the kind of facts that reminded you every secret you thought hidden was already known. They didn't threaten, they didn't need to. Fear was not in the words. Fear was in the way those men looked at you, as if measuring how long it would take before you vanished. The parents listened, nodded, sweat clinging to their foreheads even in the cool night air. They apologized on behalf of their sons, promises spilling from trembling lips, and then the men left, as quietly as they had arrived, leaving behind a silence in those houses that screamed louder than any shouted warning. The families sat awake until dawn, too shaken to close their eyes, glancing at their sons with both anger and pity. The boys had brought this into their homes, and though the men hadn't raised their voices or their fists, the message was carved deep. Touch him again, and you touch fire. By morning, the fear had traveled faster than rumor. It was in the way the teachers looked at him, their eyes softer now, filled with a nervous respect they had never shown before. It was in the way classmates moved aside in the hallway, not with disgust but with caution, creating a path for him without being asked. He could feel it in every glance, every step. The power had shifted. He was untouchable now. Yet, inside, he didn't feel untouchable. He felt hollow. He had not asked for this fear. He had not wanted the shadows of his father's world to creep into these halls, staining a place he had hoped would be his escape. He had only wanted to be a boy, a student, someone who could laugh freely without it being mistaken for dominance or control. But that life was gone now, the moment his father had stepped out of that black car. The moment the men had visited the homes of his tormentors, he had been marked. No one would ever see him the same way again, and yet he chose not to wield this fear as a weapon. He could have demanded apologies, forced them to kneel in public, used their trembling silence to feed the pride that had been denied to him for so long. He could have humiliated them as they had humiliated him, but he didn't, because deep inside, buried beneath the shadows of his father's empire, lived the words of his mother, words spoken softly on nights when the world outside their home seemed too cruel, when the weight of who he was threatened to crush him. Strength isn't about breaking others, she had told him once, her hand brushing gently through his hair. Strength is about standing when the world tries to break you. So he stood. He stood taller than before, not with fists clenched, but with shoulders straight and chin raised. When he walked into the cafeteria, he no longer carried the air of someone waiting to be mocked. He carried the air of someone untouchable, not because of his father, not because of the men in black, but because of the dignity he chose for himself. The bullies sat in their corner, silent, their laughter swallowed by their own fear. The other students watched, uncertain whether to fear him or respect him, and in that uncertainty, he found his power. Days turned into weeks, and the story of that night grew larger than the truth. Rumors twisted reality into legend. Some said the bullies' families had been threatened with ruin. Others said the men had left scars of warning. None of it was true, but the fear was enough to make the stories real. He became the boy you didn't cross, the name you didn't whisper too loudly. And though it isolated him further, it also shielded him. No one dared lay a hand on him again, but he did not let that fear consume him. He still held doors open for strangers, still helped the younger students pick up their books when they fell, still walked with the quiet humility he had always carried. Slowly, some began to see him not as a threat, but as a lesson. They watched how he never retaliated with cruelty, how he never used his new power to make others small. Instead, he showed them something rare, that even when you hold the ability to destroy, choosing mercy is the greatest strength of all. The bullies never recovered their old pride. They shrank in his presence, not because he punished them but because he forgave them by simply rising above. That forgiveness was sharper than revenge. It reminded them daily of their weakness. They had tried to break him, but he had walked away unbroken, stronger than they could ever be. And though he never sought to teach, his existence became a lesson carved into the fabric of the school. True strength was not fists. It was not cruelty. It was not fear. True strength was walking through fire and refusing to let it turn you into ash. It was rising above hate and carrying dignity where others carried shame. And in the quiet halls of that school, in the silence of those who once mocked him, that truth burned brighter than any rumor.